The cyanide capsule was already in his pocket. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in the upstairs bedroom of his house in Herrlingen, Germany, a few minutes past noon on October 14, 1944. Downstairs, two generals waited in his study. A car idled outside with a Berlin license plate, and SS men stood near the doors. Rommel had just told his wife, Lucia, that in 15 minutes he would be dead. Now he crossed the hall to his son's room. Manfred Rommel was 15, home on leave from a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft crew. He had eaten breakfast with his father that morning, walked with him in the garden, listened to him wonder aloud whether today would bring a new command or an arrest warrant for treason. His father's face was pale now. "Come outside with me," Rommel said. The most famous Field Marshal Germany had produced the Desert Fox, a name Winston Churchill himself had once praised in the House of Commons as a great and skillful general, was about to be driven into the countryside to swallow poison, on the order of Adolf Hitler. The charge was high treason. The evidence was a name muttered under torture, a name spoken by a dying general in delirium, and one conversation in a French chateau 3 months earlier that no two witnesses would ever describe the same way. To understand how Rommel arrived at that hallway, we have to go back to early summer 1944, to a headquarters on the Seine, where a colonel from Paris arrived with a question he wasn't supposed to ask directly and an answer that would follow Rommel to his grave. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, a stories where the record actually holds up, where the details come from documents and memoirs and unit logs rather than myth, then subscribe to this channel and leave a like before we go further. Costs you nothing, and it tells us this work is worth continuing. By July 1944, Rommel commanded Army Group B, defending Normandy against the Allied invasion that had begun on June 6. His headquarters sat in a chateau at La Roche-Guyon, on the Seine, 45 miles northwest of Paris. From there, he was watching a front collapse in slow motion. His entire defensive doctrine rested on one premise: the invasion had to be destroyed on the beaches, in the first 24 hours, before the Allies could land enough men and material to make the beachhead permanent. He'd told an aide that day would be the longest day for both sides, because once Allied armor got ashore in real numbers, Germany's shortages of fuel and steel would make pushing them back into the sea impossible. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt disagreed, preferring a mobile reserve held inland. Rommel had pressed Hitler directly to keep the panzer divisions close behind the coast. Hitler approved the idea in principle and never delivered it. Of 7 panzer divisions in Rommel's own sector, only 3 were under his actual command. The rest sat inland under OKW control because Hitler remained convinced, weeks after the landings, that Normandy was a feint and the real invasion was still coming at Calais. Can fell to British and Canadian troops in mid-July after a month of brutal fighting that left much of the city in rubble. American troops were grinding through the hedgerows of the Cotentin Peninsula, a terrain of sunken lanes and ancient earthen banks that turned every field into a fortress. On July 12, Rommel told Field Marshal von Kluge in writing that without reinforcement, a full Allied breakthrough should be expected within 2 to 3 weeks. There would be no reinforcement. The strategy he'd argued for and had been right about had cost him nothing but his credibility with a high command that no longer wanted to hear it. It was into this atmosphere that Lieutenant Colonel Caesar von Hoffaker arrived at La Roche-Guyon on July 9, 1944. Hoffaker was a Luftwaffe staff officer serving under General Karl Heinrich von, the military governor of Paris. He was also Claus von Stauffenberg's cousin, and he belonged to the resistance circle that had spent over a year building the plan to kill Hitler, a plan codenamed, with grim irony, Operation Valkyrie, after the Nazis' own contingency plan for internal unrest. Hoffaker had genuine staff business that day. His real purpose was to find out, finally, where Rommel stood. This wasn't the first contact. Rommel's chief of staff, Hans Speidel, had old ties to the resistance through General Ludwig Beck, the former army chief of staff, and he'd already told Rommel about a Berlin movement that was, in his words, ready and determined to remove the regime. Rommel had listened. He hadn't reported it. 11 days later, under the rules the Nazi state would begin enforcing, that silence alone would be enough to justify a death sentence. What happened in that meeting on July 9th is the single most contested conversation of Rommel's life, and it would decide whether he lived to see 1945. The accounts agree on this much. Rommel said the war in the West was lost, that he intended to seek terms with the Americans and British, and that he was prepared to act on his own authority to end the fighting on his front, opening the way for the Allies rather than continuing a defense he believed was now pointless. According to his son's later account, Rommel wanted to surrender in the West and let the Allies through, hoping that once Hitler was removed in Berlin, the transition could happen without the civil war he feared. But on the one question that mattered most, assassination, the witnesses split completely, and that split is the entire case against him. Hofacker walked away believing Rommel had endorsed the killing. He later described Rommel's words as agreement that it was both necessary and coming soon. Other accounts, including Spiedel's own post-war testimony, insist Rommel said nothing of the kind, that he spoke only of arrest, of forcing Hitler out through political or military pressure, and that Hofacker, desperate for an ally as prominent as Rommel, heard agreement where there was only exhaustion with the war. The historian Ian Beckett has argued there's no credible evidence Rommel knew more than the broad outline of the plot. Others, like Ralph George Ruth, go further, suggesting Rommel may never have known the specific date or method at all. What's not disputed is that Rommel never reported the conversation. For days later, on July 13th, he wrote one final letter to Hitler, warning that German soldiers were fighting and dying in an unequal struggle nearing its end. He didn't expect a reply. He didn't get one. For days after that, the question of Rommel's involvement in any coup became almost academic, because on July 17th, the war took him out of the fight entirely, in a way no conspirator could have planned. Around 6 in the evening on July 17th, Rommel's staff car was returning to La Rocheguyon near St. Foy de Montgomery when a flight of RAF Hawker Typhoons caught it in the open. The fighter bombers strafed the column. Rommel's driver, swerving at speed, lost control, and the car overturned. Rommel was thrown clear with a fractured skull. He was unconscious for hours and would never return to active command. There's a strange footnote buried in that attack. The British Special Air Service had organized a mission that same month built specifically around killing or capturing Rommel. Operation Gaff, a 6-man team that parachuted into France on July 25th with orders stating plainly that killing Rommel was preferable to risking a failed capture. They never got the chance. By the time they were on the ground, they learned Rommel had already been got, not by them, but by fighter pilots who had no idea whose car they'd caught on a country road that evening. The most famous field marshal in Allied propaganda had been taken off the board entirely by accident. 3 days before the plot he'd allegedly half-endorsed went off 600 miles away. Spiedel took over Army Group B's headquarters in the immediate aftermath, and within days Rommel was formally replaced. He spent the following weeks recovering, first in France, then at home in Herrlingen under medical care and, though he couldn't yet know it, under the beginning of surveillance. He was a badly injured man recovering quietly in his own house, with no command and no influence over a single division, when Claus von Stauffenberg walked into a wooden hut at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia on July 20th, carrying a briefcase packed with explosive. The bomb detonated at 12:42 p.m. It killed 4 men and wounded nearly everyone else in the room, including Hitler, who survived, in part because a heavy oak table leg absorbed much of the blast, and in part because an officer had moved the briefcase further down the table only minutes earlier to make room for his own papers. Stauffenberg, watching from outside and convinced Hitler was dead, flew to Berlin to join the rest of the conspirators in seizing army headquarters and launching the Valkyrie plan against the SS. By evening, Hitler was broadcasting to the nation, alive, and the coup collapsed within hours. Stauffenberg and 3 other officers were shot by firing squad that same night. General Beck was permitted to attempt suicide. When he only wounded himself, a subordinate finished it. What followed was not a trial. It was a manhunt, run by the Gestapo on Hitler's direct order, designed to trace every thread back through everyone who had ever spoken to a plotter, whether they'd known the plan or not. Roughly 7,000 people were eventually arrested. Around 200 were executed, some by hanging from meat hooks with piano wire, a method Hitler specifically ordered to prolong the deaths and to have them filmed as a warning. Among the first taken in France was General Vaughan, the man who had sent Hofacker to Rommel in the first place. Tried to kill himself while being transported back to Germany, shooting himself in the head but only succeeding in blinding himself. He was kept alive for further interrogation, and in his delirium he repeatedly spoke one name aloud: Rommel. A dying man's mutterings alone wouldn't have been enough to condemn a field marshal of Rommel's stature. But Hofacker was arrested in Paris on July 26th, before he could finish destroying documents or go into hiding, and the Gestapo interrogated him with the methods reserved for the conspiracy's inner circle. Eventually, under what every credible account describes as torture, he gave his interrogators a detailed account of the July 9th meeting, one in which Rommel had been told the assassination was coming, and hadn't objected. Whether that reflected what Rommel actually said, or what a man in agony believed his captors wanted to hear, no one will ever know for certain. Hofacker was tried before the People's Court in December, convicted, and hanged on December 20th, defiant to the end, reportedly telling the court's chief judge that his only regret was not carrying out the assassination himself. But by then his statement had already done its work. It had been written down and shown to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, while Hitler personally decided what to do about Erwin Rommel. Through August and September, Rommel stayed at Herrlingen, still recovering, aware that something was circling without yet knowing exactly what. On September 7th, the Gestapo arrested Hans Speidel at his own house, the man who had facilitated nearly every contact Rommel ever had with the resistance, and the man best positioned to know exactly how far Rommel had really gone. Rommel tried to reach Berlin for an explanation. None came. He understood by then what the silence meant. On October 7th, Field Marshal Keitel summoned him to Berlin directly. Rommel, citing his doctor's advice and almost certainly his own instincts, declined to go. He'd already told his ordnance officer, Captain Heinrich Lang, that after hearing about July 20th, he now understood what Hofacker had been driving at back in July. It was an ambiguous remark even then, readable either as quiet confirmation or as the dawning realization of how dangerously a private conversation could be twisted. He never got the chance to explain which he meant. On October 13th, Stuttgart's military district called Herrlingen to say two generals would visit the next day at noon. That night, Rommel told Manfred he didn't know whether it would bring a new command or something far worse. The next morning, he chose to wear his old Afrika Korps uniform. Manfred arrived home at 6 in the morning, summoned the day before. Father and son had breakfast together, then walked in the garden. Manfred asked if his father would accept a new posting if one came. Rommel took his arm and said the danger facing Germany in the east was so terrible that anything else came second, a strange answer from a man who, within hours, would have no posting to accept or refuse. Around noon, a dark green sedan with Berlin plates pulled up outside. Two generals stepped out, Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief Wehrmacht adjutant, and Ernst Mazel, there mainly as a witness. They asked, with that strange formal courtesy the regime so often used for its worst acts, to speak with the field marshal alone. Manfred and Rommel's longtime aide, Captain Hermann Aldinger, withdrew. For one brief moment, climbing the stairs to find a book, Manfred let himself believe the visit meant his father wasn't being arrested after all. Inside the study, Burgdorf did almost all the talking. He told Rommel he had been implicated in the July 20th conspiracy on the strength of statements from Von and Hofacker. Then, on Hitler's explicit instruction, he laid out the choice. Rommel could travel to Berlin, deny the charges, and stand trial before the People's Court, the same court that had already sent far less prominent men to die on meat hooks for thinner connections than his own. Or he could take the cyanide capsule Burgdorf had brought, die within minutes, and in exchange receive a state funeral, a public account of his death tied to his July 17th injuries, and a guarantee that his family and staff would face no reprisal. The conversation lasted about an hour. Rommel understood the arithmetic instantly. The People's Court, under its notorious chief judge, Roland Freisler, did not produce acquittals, it produced executions, and quite possibly the arrest of his own wife and son afterward, the same fate already visited on the families of other condemned conspirators. The poison bought his family's safety and his own public legacy in a single transaction. There was no real second choice in that room, and both men knew it. Rommel went upstairs and told Lucia. Then he crossed the hall and told Manfred to come outside with him. He put on his overcoat, pausing once to stop his dachshund from following him out the door. Aldinger and Manfred walked him to the gate. The two generals saluted. Rommel shook his son's hand, shook his aide's hand, and climbed into the back seat, positioned deliberately between Burgdorf and Mazel so he couldn't run. Outside, Gestapo officers sent from Berlin that morning watched the property under standing orders to shoot him down and storm the house if he resisted. The car drove out of the village, up a hill, and into a stretch of forest a few miles outside Herrlingen, quiet, isolated, chosen for exactly that. It stopped on a side road. Bergdorf and Maisel got out and sent the SS driver, Heinrich Deuce, several dozen yards down the road for 5 or 10 minutes. What happened in that car during those minutes has only the conflicting testimony of men who each had reason to shade their own role afterward. What's certain is the outcome. Rommel bit down on the capsule. Within roughly 3 minutes, he was dead. When Deuce returned, he found Rommel's baton on the floor and his cap fallen off. Weeping, he picked the cap up and placed it back on the dead man's head, and put the baton back in his hand so that whoever found him would find a field marshal, not a man slumped in the back seat of a Gestapo car. 10 minutes after Rommel left the house, the phone rang at Herrlingen. Aldinger answered. He was told the field marshal had died. The German government announced that Rommel had died of an embolism, a delayed complication of his July 17th injuries. It was a useful lie, because it attached his death to an injury the public already knew about, and required no mention of treason or the People's Court or a hero-handed poison in his own study. Hitler ordered a state funeral and a day of national mourning. Rundstedt himself, who had clashed with Rommel for a year over Panzer doctrine, traveled to Ulm to deliver the eulogy, while the men who had sent Rommel to his death sat among the official mourners. Lucia and Manfred were left untouched, the one part of Bergdorf's bargain the regime actually honored. The truth didn't surface in Germany until after the war. Manfred, who had stood beside his father in that final hour, lived to testify to what he'd witnessed, and went on to serve as mayor of Stuttgart for 2 decades. He never described his father as an operational member of the conspiracy, only as a man who had heard enough, and said enough, that the regime decided he couldn't be allowed to live. Historians have never closed the question his testimony left open, and likely never will. Every direct witness is dead, and the record itself was shaped by torture and decades of post-war reputation management on every side. Some place Rommel as a genuine, cautious participant in the resistance, sympathetic to removing Hitler by whatever means proved necessary, even if he personally preferred a trial to a bomb. Others conclude he knew far less than the case against him assumed, that he was condemned less for what he'd actually done than for what he'd become in the public imagination. A national hero whose well-known doubts about the war made him a convenient name onto which other men's confessions, extracted under torture, could be pinned. What's documented beyond dispute is this. Rommel never reported a conspiracy. He had at least partial knowledge of itself enough, under the regime's new rules, for execution. He'd written directly to Hitler, twice, urging an end to a war he correctly believed could not be won. He'd told his own son that Germany's only path forward required removing the man at the top of it. And when 2 generals arrived at his door with a cyanide capsule and a choice that wasn't really a choice, he made the calculation any father might make, in under an hour, with his wife and son waiting upstairs. Rommel's death, and the elaborate lie the regime told about it, became one of the foundations of what historians now call the Rommel myth, the post-war image of the good German, the honorable soldier who fought a clean war in the desert and was murdered by the regime he'd quietly turned against. That image served Germany, rebuilding a military identity it could live with. It served British and American officers who'd faced him in North Africa and preferred to remember a worthy opponent rather than another instrument of Hitler's war machine. The reality historians have pieced together since sits in a harder middle ground. Rommel was a brilliant commander who served the Nazi state loyally for most of his career, who arrived late and ambivalently at any real opposition to Hitler, who never lifted a hand to stop the plot or to support it outright, and who was killed anyway, less because of conclusive proof of what he'd done than because the men deciding his fate needed the act of removing him more than they needed the truth of what had actually been said in a chateau study on a July afternoon. The house at Herrlingen still stands. Rommel is buried in the village cemetery, not far from where the car carrying him to his death turned up the hill into the trees. His son's account of that final morning, the breakfast, the walk in the garden, the quarter hour his father gave him to say goodbye, remains the clearest window historians have into how one of the most famous men in the German army spent his last hours, caught between a war he'd told his superiors in writing could not be won, and a conspiracy he likely never fully joined, and from which he was never quite separated either.